In 1932, a family of 4 vanished during a devastating storm. But it wasn't just the people who disappeared. Their entire house was wiped clean off the map, as if it never existed. For 75 years, the case went cold, a tragic ghost story buried by time. Then, the ocean gave up a secret. The impossible remains of their house were found on an LA shore. Officials called it a freak flood, an unstoppable act of nature. But when a determined historian started digging, she found a message scrawled in a dusty old record, a terrifying secret someone tried to bury forever. It said, "They didn't drown, they were taken." So, was this a tragic accident? Or a perfectly executed crime designed to silence a family forever? Subscribe now so you won't miss similar chilling stories on our channel in the future. And tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love seeing where our audience tunes in from. The storm that hit the coast in the winter of 2007 was a monster. It wasn't a hurricane with a name and a neatly plotted path on the news. It was a raw, nameless force of nature that clawed at the Los Angeles shoreline for 3 days straight, churning the Pacific into a gray, frothing rage. Waves, black with dredged sand and secrets, slammed against the seawalls, their roar a constant, visceral threat that you felt in your bones. Eleanor Grant had lived on this coast for most of her 62 years and had seen her share of storms, but this one felt different. It felt like an exorcism, like the ocean was finally spitting out something it had been forced to hold down for a very long time. When it was over, the water receded, leaving behind a scarred and littered landscape, and among the kelp and driftwood, something impossible rested on the sand, a house, or what was left of one. It wasn't a boat, not a pier, but the mangled skeleton of a home, splintered beams, a warped doorframe, pieces of a life that had no business being in the ocean. The call came to Eleanor not because she was a detective or a city official, but because she was the unofficial keeper of the coast's memories. As a retired history teacher, she ran the local historical society blog, a quiet corner of the internet where she pieced together forgotten stories from old photographs and faded letters. A friend from the county sheriff's department, knowing her passion for local mysteries, gave her a heads up. "You need to see this, Eleanor," he'd said, his voice low and strange. "It's wrong, just wrong." He gave her a location, a stretch of restricted beach where cranes were already groaning to life, their mechanical necks bent over the debris. Eleanor felt a familiar pull, a mixture of academic curiosity and a deeper, more solemn duty. She grabbed her coat, her notepad, and the keys to her old reliable car, a sense of profound unease settling over her. She drove toward the sea, toward the impossible house the ocean had given back. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay, the sky a bruised purple. As she approached the yellow tape, the sheer scale of the wreckage hit her. It was a chaotic burial mound of wood, dark and waterlogged, twisted into shapes of agony. It looked less like a structure and more like the fossilized remains of some great beast. Eleanor was given a hard hat and permission to observe from a safe distance. But a safe distance was never her way. With a quiet nod to the foreman she knew, she stepped past the official perimeter, her sensible shoes sinking into the wet sand. She ran a gloved hand over a massive support beam, the wood so saturated it felt more like stone. Barnacles clung to its surface like grotesque jewels. How long had this been down there? A decade? 2? It felt ancient. She moved through the wreckage with a practiced reverence, her eyes scanning for details others would miss. A piece of a window frame still holding a shard of glass, clouded and blind. A rusted hinge that might have belonged to a kitchen cabinet. Each piece was a silent witness. She imagined a family living within these walls, their laughter echoing against the very wood she now touched. A profound sadness washed over her, a grief for people she had never known. For hours, she worked alongside the cleanup crew, documenting, photographing, feeling. Then, one of the workers called out, pointing to a piece of wood half buried in the sand. Nailed into it, green with age but still legible, was a small brass plate. Eleanor knelt, her knees aching, and wiped the grime away. The engraving was simple, hand-stamped. September 14, 1932. The date struck Eleanor like a physical blow. September 14th, 1932. It wasn't just a random date, it was a ghost. It was the date of the Great Pasadena Flood, a torrential downpour that turned the Arroyo Seco into a raging river, washing away homes and lives. And it was the date the Myers family, Thomas, his wife Margaret, and their 2 young children, vanished without a trace. Their house, located perilously close to the floodplains, was reported as being utterly obliterated. The official story, repeated for 75 years, was that the house and the family were swept away, their remains lost forever in the violent deluge. But that was in Pasadena, miles and miles inland. What was a piece of their home doing here, spat out by the Pacific Ocean? It didn't make any sense. It was geographically impossible. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. This wasn't just debris, this was evidence. The foreman, a gruff but decent man, saw the look on her face. "Something wrong, Ellie?" She could only point to the date, her voice a whisper. The Myers family. The discovery of the date plate changed the energy of the site. The workers grew quieter, more careful. What had been a routine salvage operation now felt like an archaeological dig at a sacred site. As they carefully lifted a massive, warped section of what looked like an interior wall, something small and metallic tumbled out from between the beams and landed softly in the sand. It was a tin whistle. Small, simple, the kind a child might carry in their pocket. It was dented and corroded, but it was undeniably a toy, a child's toy. Eleanor picked it up, her fingers trembling. She held in her hand a fragile, tangible piece of a lost life. The hollow ache of sadness she'd felt earlier sharpened into a piercing point of connection. This belonged to a child who had been playing one moment and was gone the next. Hope, fierce and unexpected, surged through her. This little whistle was more than just an artifact. It was a voice that had been silenced for 3/4 of a century, and it was her job to listen. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that she couldn't let this go. That night she wrote a post for her blog, carefully detailing the discovery of the house remains, the impossible location, the brass plate, and the child's tin whistle. She connected it all to the cold case of the Myers family, posing the question, what really happened on that stormy night in 1932? The post went viral in their small coastal community. People were fascinated, horrified, and hungry for answers. For a day, Eleanor felt a sense of purpose, of bringing a forgotten story back into the light. It was a fragile, hopeful high. The next afternoon, as she was archiving photos of the whistle, a man in a perfectly tailored gray suit appeared at the Historical Society, which was really just a cramped, dusty office Eleanor ran out of a donated storefront. He was handsome, with silvering temples and a smile that seemed warm but didn't quite reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Deputy Councilman Richard Kearns, the city's preservation officer. "Mrs. Grant," he began, his voice smooth as silk, "I read your blog post. Fascinating stuff." Truly. He radiated an aura of polished authority, the kind that made people instinctively sit up straighter. He browsed a shelf of dusty records, feigning interest. "But you know," he said, turning back to her, "sometimes these old stories, they're better left where they are. Tragedies like this, they open up old wounds for the community." Eleanor felt her guard go up. "The truth is never an old wound, Mr. Kearns. It's a missing piece." Kearns gave a soft, paternal chuckle. "Of course, but we must consider the living. Dredging up a 75-year-old flood accident, it's irrelevant debris. We have permits to consider. City development plans for that shoreline." He took a step closer, his friendly mask slipping just a little. It would be a shame for misinformation to complicate important city projects. He adjusted his tie, a small, precise gesture. Then he leaned in, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper that was colder than the ocean wind. "Leave the past alone, Mrs. Grant. Some things are buried for a reason." He smiled that empty smile one last time, turned and walked out, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and a chilling silence in his wake. Eleanor stood frozen in the middle of the room, her heart pounding. That wasn't a suggestion, it was a threat. The hopeful warmth from her discovery evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Who was this man, and why was he so determined to shut down an inquiry into a family that had been dead for 75 years? What important city projects could possibly be threatened by the truth? She looked down at the tin whistle sitting on her desk. Its silence was deafening. The joy of discovery was gone, replaced by the weight of a terrible secret. She was no longer just a historian uncovering a mystery. She had stumbled into something dark, something that was still being actively protected. Kearns's warning wasn't about preserving the peace of the community, it was about enforcing silence. The chill of fear was real, but beneath it, something else was kindling. A stubborn, quiet rage. The kind of anger only a teacher can feel when they see a bully trying to erase a story from the board. She picked up the small, weathered whistle, its cold metal a stark reality in her palm. The ghost of a child's laughter seemed to cling to it. In the lonely silence of her office, with the shadows growing long outside, she made a quiet vow to the lost child, to the silenced family. "I'll find your names," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "I'll bring you home." But as she looked out the window at the darkening street, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the storm of 1932 was far from over. Richard Kearns's veiled threat hung in the air of Eleanor's small office long after he was gone, a toxic residue that soured the scent of old paper and lemon polish. The man had moved with the frictionless confidence of someone who had never been told no in his life, and his words, delivered with that hollow smile, had been a masterclass in intimidation. Leave the past alone. It was an order, not a suggestion. For a long, heart-thumping moment, Eleanor felt the cold grip of genuine fear. She was 62 years old, a widow who lived on a modest pension. Who was she to challenge a man like Kearns, a man who spoke of city projects and old wounds as if he were moving chess pieces on a board only he could see? The sensible part of her, the part that paid bills and locked her doors at night, screamed at her to stop. She had the whistle. She had honored the discovery. Now drop it. Let the dead rest. But when she looked at the small, dented instrument on her desk, she didn't see an artifact. She saw a child's last breath, a story that had been stolen. The fear didn't vanish, but it was pushed aside by a stronger, more stubborn emotion: indignation. The feeling that had made her the teacher students both respected and dreaded, the one who would not tolerate a bully. Kearns was a bully, using his power to silence the powerless. Her vow to the child, made in the quiet of her office, was no longer just a sentimental promise. It was a declaration of war. The next morning, Eleanor drove to the Pasadena Central Library, a place that had always been her sanctuary. The hushed reverence of the archives, the earthy smell of aging paper, the rhythmic whir of the microfilm reader, it was a world of facts, of tangible history, and it grounded her. Kearns could spin his narrative in the world of politics and power, but here, in the records, the truth waited patiently to be found. She spent hours scrolling through reels of the Pasadena Chronicle from the weeks surrounding the September 1932 flood. Her eyes ached from the strain of reading the flickering, ghostly text. She found countless articles about the storm, the rising waters, the heroic rescues, the tragic losses. The Myers family was mentioned only briefly, a single paragraph listing them among the missing, their home lost to the torrent. It was a neat, tidy explanation, too tidy. She was about to give up for the day, her shoulders slumping with fatigue and disappointment, when a small headline from a week before the flood caught her eye. It was buried on page 5, a minor local news brief. Local carpenter accused of fraud. Her heart sank. The carpenter was Thomas Myers. The article was short on details, alleging that Myers had used subpar materials on a city-funded construction project and had falsified invoices. The shame and doubt washed over her. Had she been romanticizing this family? Was Thomas Myers not a victim, but a con man who had simply run from the law, using the storm as cover? It was a plausible theory, and for a crushing moment, it felt like the end of her quest. The story suddenly seemed cheap and ugly. But as she kept reading, her teacher's eye for nuance kicked in. The final sentences of the article were what mattered. The reporter noted that while the official accusation came from a city inspector, whispers in the community suggested Myers was a meticulous and honest craftsman. Several unnamed neighbors claimed he was being framed by a larger, more powerful construction firm that wanted his contracts and, more importantly, the land his family owned, a prime parcel that blocked a planned city expansion. There it was. The first flicker of real hope. A motive. Thomas Myers wasn't a criminal. He was a man standing in the way of progress, or more accurately, in the way of profit. Eleanor felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind that came with connecting two disparate clues. This changed everything. It meant that on the night of the storm, the Myers family wasn't just facing a wall of water, they were facing powerful enemies. She printed the article, the paper warm from the machine, and held it like a sacred text. This was her proof. This was what she could use to force the city to look again. The feeling was exhilarating, a pure intellectual triumph that made her feel alive and purposeful. The community meeting was held a week later in a soulless, beige room at City Hall. The air was stale, smelling of weak coffee and bureaucracy. Eleanor sat with her hands clasped tightly around her notes, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She was not on the official agenda, but she had signed up for the public comment period, a 3-minute slot that felt both impossibly short and terrifyingly long. When her name was called, she walked to the podium, her knees feeling weak. The city council members, including Richard Kearns, looked down at her from their elevated dais with expressions ranging from boredom to polite indifference. Kearns gave her a small, tight nod, his face a mask of professional courtesy. It made her stomach churn. She began to speak, her voice a little shaky at first, but gaining strength as she laid out her findings. She spoke of the house wreckage, the impossible location, the date plate. She held up the child's tin whistle, a silent, powerful indictment. Then, she read from the newspaper article about Thomas Myers, explaining the accusations of fraud and the whispers that he was being framed over a land dispute. This was not just a tragic accident, she concluded, her voice ringing with conviction. There is evidence to suggest the Myers family was in danger before the first drop of rain ever fell. I am asking the council to officially reopen this case. She finished, her chest heaving slightly, and a polite, scattered applause broke out from the dozen or so residents in the audience. She felt a glimmer of success. She had done it. She had spoken the truth to power. Then, Richard Kearns leaned into his microphone. "Thank you, Mrs. Grant," he said, his voice dripping with condescending warmth. "We all appreciate your passion for local history. It's a wonderful hobby." He dismissed her entire presentation with a single word, hobby. The air went out of the room. "However," he continued, steepling his fingers, "we must rely on facts, not 75-year-old rumors from an unnamed source in a newspaper. The official reports from 1932 are quite clear. The family was tragically lost in a natural disaster. To suggest otherwise, without a single piece of new, concrete evidence, is irresponsible. It's sensationalism." He looked at her with faux pity, as if she were a confused child. "The city's resources are stretched thin. We cannot, and will not, divert manpower to chase ghost stories. We are focused on the future of this community, not on reopening painful chapters of the past based on what amounts to shoreline debris." He then adjusted his tie, the gesture so precise it seemed to slice the air. He had not just disagreed with her, he had publicly humiliated her. He had painted her as a sentimental old fool, a troublemaker. The other council members nodded in agreement, their faces now closed and dismissive. Eleanor walked back to her seat, her face burning, the eyes of the audience on her. The hope and triumph she had felt were shattered, replaced by a profound and bitter sense of defeat. She drove straight back to the library, not wanting to go home to her empty house. The shame from the meeting clung to her like a wet coat. Kearns had won. He had effortlessly turned her facts into fantasy, her righteous quest into a foolish hobby. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was just stirring up ghosts. Defeated, she packed up her notes, ready to surrender, but she couldn't bring herself to leave just yet. She felt a pull to look at the microfilm one last time, to see the words that had given her so much hope before it was all torn down. She threaded the reel into the machine, her movements slow and weary. The article appeared on the screen, a monument to her failure. She scrolled past it, her eyes blurring with frustration, and then she saw it. A flicker in the margin, on the edge of the frame. Something she had missed before. It was faint, a ghostly shadow on the digitized image. Her historian's brain knew what it was, the faint bleed-through of writing from the reverse side of the newspaper page, captured by the camera decades ago. Her breath caught. With trembling hands, she zoomed in, adjusting the focus knob with frantic precision. The image sharpened. It wasn't just a smudge, it was handwriting. A short, panicked scribble, left in the margin by some unknown person 75 years ago. A message from the past, clear as a scream, 4 words that changed everything. They didn't drown, they were taken. The words glowed on the screen, a spectral message from a 75-year-old ghost. They didn't drown, they were taken. Eleanor stared, her breath held tight in her chest, the rhythmic clatter of the library fading into a distant hum. This was not a rumor. This was a statement. An assertion left by someone who knew something, someone who had seen the official story taking shape and had scrawled a desperate, anonymous protest in the margins of history. The crushing humiliation of the city council meeting dissolved, replaced by a cold, electrifying certainty. Kearns hadn't just been dismissing a hobbyist, he had been actively suppressing a murder investigation. The exhaustion that had settled deep into her bones an hour ago was burned away by a fresh surge of adrenaline. She wasn't chasing a ghost story, she was hunting a crime. She carefully printed the magnified image of the note, the ink forming a stark, damning piece of evidence. The words felt dangerous to hold, a secret that had cost a family their lives and was still potent enough to warrant threats from a man like Kearns. She slid the paper into a folder, her movements deliberate and precise. The war was back on, but now she knew what she was fighting. It wasn't just neglect or indifference, it was a cover-up. This new revelation, this hidden message, reignited her search with a desperate urgency. If the Myers family were taken, then the official narrative was a lie from start to finish. She needed more than whispers and marginalia. She needed to find the family's voice. She turned her attention away from the newspapers and toward the Pasadena School archives, a place she knew held the small, personal histories that official records overlooked. She spent days sifting through boxes of brittle, yellowed student records from the 1930s, the scent of acidic paper and dust filling her nostrils. It was meticulous, soul-crushing work. And then, at the bottom of a box labeled Third-Grade Compositions, 1932, she found it, a composition book with a faded blue cover. In the corner, written in the careful, looping cursive of a child just mastering the pen, was the name Sarah Myers. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened it. The pages were filled with the innocent observations of a young girl, essays about her cat, drawings of her family, a story about a summer picnic. It was a window into a life abruptly extinguished. Then she turned to the last entry. It was dated September 13, 1932, the day before the storm, the day before they vanished. The essay was titled, "The Storm Coming." But it wasn't about the weather. The handwriting was shaky, different from the neat script on the previous pages. It spoke of a different kind of storm. Sarah wrote about the loud men in suits who came to talk to her father, their voices like thunder rumbling through the thin walls of their small house. She wrote about her mother crying in the kitchen late at night. The last lines were a child's attempt to process an adult terror she couldn't comprehend. "Papa says we have to be brave. He says we won't let the storm wash us away. He says our roots are strong here." Eleanor felt a wave of profound sorrow. This wasn't a school assignment. It was a child's diary of her family's final, terrifying days. This was Sarah Myers, speaking across 7 decades, confirming that the threat was not the rain, but men in suits. The innocent words were more chilling than any official report. The personal, emotional weight of it was staggering. Eleanor closed the book, holding it to her chest. The tin whistle had been the child's toy. This book was her voice. This small, fragile book was the beating heart of the truth. It was a moment of incredible connection, a feeling of pure, unassailable purpose that soared above the fear and the doubt. She had found them. She could hear them. That night, she sat at her kitchen table. The composition book and the photo of the microfilm note laid out before her like sacred relics. The house was quiet, the silence pressing in on her. The weight of what she was doing, of who she was up against, suddenly felt immense and isolating. Just as a wave of loneliness threatened to overwhelm her, the back door creaked open. Her granddaughter, Claire, stood in the doorway, a sketchbook under her arm and a worried look on her face. At 17, Claire was a whirlwind of restless energy, sharp intelligence, and youthful cynicism. She and Eleanor shared a deep bond, forged in the space left by Eleanor's estranged son, Claire's father. "Grandma, you okay?" Claire asked, dropping her bag on a chair. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor managed a weak smile. "In a way, I have." She gestured to the papers on the table. For the next hour, Eleanor told her everything about the wreckage, Kearns's threat, the fraud accusations, and finally, the note and the little girl's composition book. Claire, who usually vibrated with the impatience of her generation, listened with a rare, focused stillness. She picked up the composition book, her long fingers tracing Sarah Myers's name. When Eleanor finished, Claire didn't express doubt or tell her she was crazy. She just looked at her grandmother, her eyes filled with a fierce loyalty that warmed Eleanor to her core. "Okay," Claire said, her voice firm. "So what's our next move?" The simple word "our" was a lifeline. Eleanor was no longer alone in this. The hope and relief that flooded her was so powerful it almost brought her to tears. She had an ally. Claire immediately began tapping on her phone, her thumbs flying across the screen. "These land disputes, the city expansion, all that stuff is public record, right? Just buried." "I can find it." While Eleanor was at home in the world of paper and microfilm, Claire navigated the digital world with an intuitive grace that amazed her. Together, late into the night, they became a team, a bridge between two centuries. They made a plan. Claire would dig into online archives of city planning documents and property deeds from the era. Eleanor would go to the county archives to look for the physical maps, the ones that couldn't be altered with a keystroke. Before Claire left, she made her grandmother promise to take precautions. They set up a system of coded text messages for check-ins when Eleanor was out researching. 2 question marks means you're okay but need to talk, Claire instructed. 3 means you're in trouble. It was a game to Claire, perhaps, but to Eleanor, it was a terrifyingly real necessity. The feeling of having her granddaughter by her side, of being a team, was a powerful emotional high. They were the Grants, 2 generations of stubborn women, standing together against a shadow. The next day at the archives, that feeling of hope carried Eleanor through hours of tedious work. She finally located a set of municipal planning maps from 1932. With a magnifying glass, she found it. A small hand-drawn square on the outskirts of Pasadena, labeled Myers Property. Just as the old newspaper article suggested, it was perfectly positioned to block a proposed new roadway. It was the corroboration she needed. A retired archivist, a kind man with watery eyes named Mr. Henderson, saw what she was looking at. "That's an old one," he murmured, peering over her shoulder. "Funny thing about those maps, the later versions from 33 onward, that roadway is there, but the Myers plot is just gone. Not sold, not eminent domained, just erased." He shuffled away, leaving Eleanor with another piece of the chilling puzzle. The city hadn't just taken their land, they had wiped it from history. She felt a profound sense of victory. This was it. The fraud charge, the land dispute, the erasure from the map, it all pointed to a deliberate, violent seizure. She packed her things, a triumphant smile on her face, and walked out into the late afternoon sun, ready to call Claire with the good news. She got into her car, turned the key in the ignition, and nothing. A dead click. She tried again. Nothing. Annoyed, she called for a tow truck. An hour later, the mechanic, a grizzled man named Sal, was wiping grease from his hands. He had a grim look on his face. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "your battery's fine, your starter's fine." He held up a thin, severed piece of rubber tubing. "Someone cut your brake line. Clean through. If you'd been parked on any kind of incline, you wouldn't have had any brakes at all." The triumphant warmth drained out of Eleanor's body, replaced by an icy wave of terror. This wasn't a warning anymore. It wasn't a public shaming. This was a direct, physical threat. Kearns, or whoever he represented, wasn't just trying to scare her off. They were willing to kill her to keep the 75-year-old secret of the Myers family buried. The shadow she was fighting had a face, and it had just tried to put her in a grave. The severed brake line lay in the mechanic's greasy palm like a dead snake. Eleanor stared at it, the blood draining from her face, leaving a cold, clammy hollowness in her stomach. Sal, the mechanic, must have seen the shock in her eyes. "You should call the cops, ma'am," he said, his voice low and serious. But Eleanor knew, with a certainty that was as chilling as the act itself, that calling the police would be useless. Who would she report? A phantom with a tool? Who would believe that a city councilman was connected to a cut brake line over a 75-year-old cold case? They would file a report, call it random vandalism, and she would be right back where she started, only now the people she was investigating would know she was running scared. No. This was not the act of a random vandal. This was a message, delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon. It said, "We know where you are, we can get to you, and next time, we won't miss." The fear was a physical thing now, a metallic taste in the back of her throat. It was no longer an abstract threat. It was the screech of tires that wouldn't catch, the sickening lurch of a car sailing into an intersection. The faces of the Myers children flashed in her mind. This was how it started for them, too, with threats escalating to violence, with powerful men deciding their lives were worth less than a plot of land. The terror was real, but in its wake came a cold, hard fury. They hadn't just tried to hurt her, they had insulted her. They thought she was a weak old woman who would crumble at the first sign of real danger. They had underestimated her. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves outside her window, sent a jolt of fear through her. She sat in her armchair in the dark, the small tin whistle clutched in her hand, its cool metal a strange comfort. She was in over her head, she knew that, but retreating felt like a betrayal, not just to the Myers family, but to herself. In the quiet darkness, she thought about her life, about the small moments of injustice she had witnessed and stayed silent on, both as a teacher and as a mother. This was her chance, maybe her last one, to stand for something that mattered, to refuse to be silenced. When the first gray light of dawn broke through her window, her decision was made. Fear would not win. The attempt on her life hadn't broken her, it had galvanized her. She called Claire, her voice steadier than she felt. "They cut my brake line." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, then a burst of frantic energy. "Grandma, that's it. We're done. This isn't worth it. He's going to kill you." Claire's voice was high with panic, a daughter's love manifesting as desperate fear. "No," Eleanor said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It means we're closer than ever. It means we have them running scared." This was a turning point. She had to choose between her own safety and the truth, and the choice, terrifying as it was, felt clear. Her brush with death had given her a new, sharper focus. If Kearns was this desperate, the roots of the cover-up had to be deep, entangled in the very foundations of the city's power structure. She and Claire pored over the digital archives Claire had unearthed, cross-referencing names from the 1932 City Council with the construction firms of the era. It was a tangled web of shell corporations and interlocking directorates designed to obscure and confuse. But Claire was relentless, a digital bloodhound on a scent, and then she found it. A survey ledger from 1933, detailing construction permits for the new roadway that had been planned over the Myers property. Most of the entries were routine, but one line made Eleanor's blood run cold. A permit for a section of foundational work, filed and approved in record time just weeks after the flood, had been halted. The reason cited was unstable ground, but it was the signature at the bottom of the permit that made her stop breathing. It was signed by the city works foreman of the time, Alistair Kearns. Richard Kearns's grandfather. The name felt like a curse, a dark inheritance passed down through generations. The corruption wasn't new, it was a family business. This discovery was a small, satisfying victory, a direct link. It wasn't just a theory anymore. The Kearns family had been there, at the site, right after the Myers family had been washed away. Hope, fierce and sharp, cut through the lingering fear. This was the connection she had been praying for. Their research into the land deeds yielded more. Claire traced the ownership records for the entire area surrounding the Myers property. In the years leading up to the flood, a single development corporation had been buying up all the small family-owned plots of land, all of them except one. The Myers property stood alone, a defiant holdout in a sea of sold land. This was no longer just about a roadway. It was about a large-scale community relocation scandal, a pattern of pressure and intimidation. Thomas Myers hadn't just been a stubborn carpenter. He had been the last line of defense for his community. This revelation painted him in a new, heroic light. Eleanor felt a deep, profound respect for this man she had never met, a man who had stared down corporate and civic corruption to protect his home. The small win felt huge, a confirmation that her instincts had been right all along. She was uncovering not just a murder, but a massive historical injustice. Her victory, however, was short-lived. The very next day, a courier delivered a thick, official-looking envelope to her door. Her hands shook as she tore it open. It was a legal notice, a cease and desist order from the city attorney's office. The language was cold and brutal. She was formally accused of trespassing on a protected city shoreline, the wreckage site, and of misuse of public records for the purpose of malicious speculation. The document was filled with legal jargon designed to intimidate, but the message was simple: stop digging or we will ruin you. The final paragraphs laid out the potential consequences: heavy fines, a possible restraining order barring her from all city archives, and even criminal charges. Richard Kearns's fingerprints were all over it. This was his move on the chessboard, a clinical, bureaucratic checkmate. His influence was chillingly clear. He wasn't just some councilman. He was the gatekeeper of the city's secrets, and he had just used the full weight of the law to slam the gate in her face. The legal notice was a devastating blow. It stripped away her access, her credibility, and her freedom to investigate. It isolated her, turning her from a historian into a potential criminal. The soaring hope she had felt just a day before plummeted into a dark abyss of despair. She was trapped. Any move she made now could land her in court. Kearns had outmaneuvered her completely. That evening, her phone rang. It was an unlisted number. When she answered, Richard Kearns's smooth, confident voice filled the line. There was no pretense of friendliness this time. "Mrs. Grant," he said, his tone as cold as a morgue slab, "I trust you received our correspondence." She couldn't speak, her throat tight with a mixture of rage and fear. "I suggest you read it very carefully," he continued. "Consider it my final piece of advice. Some things, as I said, are better left buried. It would be a tragedy for a woman of your standing in the community to become entangled in legal troubles at this stage in your life." There was a soft, almost inaudible sound on his end of the line, a faint rustle of silk. In her mind's eye she could see him, perfectly calm, adjusting his tie before delivering the final crushing threat. Then he hung up, leaving a dial tone buzzing in her ear like a final mocking taunt. The line had been drawn. He had threatened her life, and when that failed, he had come for her reputation, her freedom. She was utterly cornered, with the ghost of a murdered family on one side and the full, corrupt power of the city on the other. And she had no idea what to do next. The legal notice felt like a cage. Every time Eleanor even thought about visiting an archive or making a phone call, the specter of Kearns's threat loomed over her, a cold promise of public ruin. For days, a heavy, suffocating despair settled over her house. The investigation was dead. She had failed the Myers family. The fury that had propelled her forward after the brake line incident was now choked by a paralyzing fear, not for her life, but for her dignity, for the quiet, respectable life she had so carefully built. Kearns hadn't needed a weapon. He had used the law itself to crush her. The vibrant hope she had shared with Claire just a week ago now seemed like a naive dream. She stopped answering Claire's calls, too ashamed to admit she had been so thoroughly and humiliatingly beaten. The silence in her home was no longer peaceful. It was the sound of surrender. She put the tin whistle, the composition book, and all her research into a box and pushed it into the back of her closet, burying the ghosts along with her own broken promise. It felt like a funeral. Then, another storm rolled in off the Pacific, not as violent as the one that had unearthed the house, but a sullen gray downpour that lashed against her windows for 2 days straight. The rhythmic drumming of the rain was a constant, mournful reminder of the night the Myers family vanished. Trapped inside, Eleanor found herself wandering from room to room, the weight of her defeat a physical presence in the house. On the third morning, her friend from the sheriff's department called again. His voice was hesitant. "Ellie, another tide washed some more junk ashore from that same site, mostly splinters. But, well, something caught my eye. Thought you might want to see it, off the record." A flicker of the old curiosity, buried under layers of fear, stirred within her, despite every rational instinct screaming at her to say no, to stay inside her legal cage. She heard herself agree. She drove to a small, private marina where her friend was waiting, the rain plastering her hair to her face. He led her to a shed, and there, sitting in a plastic evidence tub, was a pocket watch. It was rusted shut, its face clouded, but on the back, miraculously preserved, were the engraved initials T.M. Thomas Myers. It was his. Eleanor picked it up, the cold, heavy weight of it settling in her palm. The watch was more than an object. It was a final, silent testament from a man whose voice had been stolen. Using a pair of tweezers from her bag, she carefully worked the back open. The delicate inner workings were a mess of rust and corrosion, but the hands were still visible, frozen in time. They were stopped at 9:17 p.m. Holding that watch, knowing it had ticked off the final seconds of a man's life, broke something open inside Eleanor. The despair that had held her captive cracked. This was no longer just about justice. It was about memory. It was about refusing to let a good man's name be erased. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but a greater, more powerful feeling was taking its place, a profound sense of duty. This watch was a sign, a final plea from the past that she couldn't ignore. The legal notice, the threats, Kearns himself, they all seemed secondary to the weight of the small, broken timepiece in her hand. This single artifact reignited the entire investigation. That evening, Eleanor drove to a place she hadn't been in years, a small, immaculately kept house in the oldest part of town. It was the home of Mrs. Gabriela Alvarez. At 94, Mrs. Alvarez was one of the last living links to the Pasadena of 1932. Eleanor had interviewed her years ago for a piece on local life during the Great Depression. She was sharp, her memory, a vivid tapestry of details others had long forgotten. Eleanor sat with her in a cozy living room that smelled of lavender and old books, the rain still tapping at the windows. She placed the pocket watch gently on the table between them. "Do you remember the Myers family, Mrs. Alvarez?" she asked softly. The old woman's eyes, cloudy with age, sharpened with a sudden, painful clarity. "Oh, yes," she whispered, her voice a fragile, papery rustle. "Thomas and Margaret. Good people. He was a fine carpenter. She made the best lemon cake in the neighborhood." A sad, distant smile touched her lips. Eleanor then told her about the discovery of the house, about her investigation, about the resistance she was meeting. Finally, she slid the watch closer. "This was found in the wreckage. The hands are stopped at 9:17. Mrs. Alvarez stared at the watch, her wrinkled hands trembling as she reached for it. For a long moment, she was silent. Then she looked up at Eleanor, her eyes wide with a secret she had carried for over 70 years. "That's not possible," she said, her voice barely audible. "The officials. They always said the house was washed away in the first big surge, around 7 o'clock. Eleanor leaned forward. "What do you remember?" "The lanterns," Mrs. Alvarez whispered. "I remember the lanterns. My bedroom window faced their house. It was late that night, long after the worst of the rain had passed. It must have been after 9. I saw lanterns moving around their property, several of them, bobbing in the dark. This was it, a living witness, a direct contradiction of the official timeline. Hope, pure and brilliant, blazed through Eleanor. This testimony could change everything, but then Mrs. Alvarez's face crumpled with a deeper, more painful memory. Tears welled in her eyes. "My father," she began, her voice cracking. "He worked for the city, Department of Public Works." That night, his foreman came to the door, a cruel man. My father didn't want to go out in the storm, but the foreman insisted. She paused, taking a shaky breath. He told my father he had orders for a special crew. I heard him say the name. A man named Kearns gave the order. The name hit Eleanor like a punch to the gut. Alistair Kearns. "What was the order?" Eleanor asked, her voice hushed. Mrs. Alvarez looked away, staring out the rain-streaked window at the dark street. "They were ordered to open the secondary sluice gate up the arroyo. My father told my mother it was madness. That gate was only for catastrophic overflow. Opening it would create a flash flood, a focused torrent of water aimed directly at the small houses on the floodplain." She turned back to Eleanor, her eyes filled with the ancient shame of a child who had overheard a terrible truth. It was aimed directly at the Myers home. My father argued, but the foreman told him Kearns's orders were not to be questioned. He said it was to relieve pressure on the main dam. But my father knew. It wasn't about relieving pressure, it was about creating it. The revelation was staggering in its simple, brutal evil. The flood that killed the Myers family was not an act of God. It was a deliberate, engineered act of murder. They had used the storm as a weapon. They hadn't just allowed the family to drown, they had pointed a river at their house and pulled the trigger. The scale of the conspiracy, the sheer cold-bloodedness of it, left Eleanor speechless. She left Mrs. Alvarez's house in a daze, the rain having finally stopped. The world seemed different, darker. She had the truth, a truth far more monstrous than she could have ever imagined. The sense of vindication was overwhelming, a righteous fire burning away the last of her fear. But as she walked the 2 blocks back to where she'd parked her car, a feeling of unease began to creep in. The street was too quiet. A street lamp flickered overhead, casting long, dancing shadows. When she arrived home, the feeling of wrongness intensified. As she put her key in the lock of her apartment door, she realized she didn't need it. The door was already slightly ajar, her heart hammered against her ribs. She pushed it open slowly. The neat, orderly sanctuary of her home had been violated. Books were pulled from shelves, couch cushions were overturned, drawers were hanging open. It wasn't the work of a common burglar looking for valuables. Her television and a small collection of silver were untouched. This was a search. They had been looking for something specific. They had been looking for her research, her evidence. In that moment, a new, more personal terror gripped her. They knew she had talked to Mrs. Alvarez. They had been watching her. And now, they had been in her home. Just as she was processing this, her phone buzzed. It was Claire. "Grandma, where are you? Are you okay?" Her granddaughter's voice was tight with panic. "Dad called. He told me to tell you to stop. He said you have no idea who you're messing with. He said they will destroy our whole family if you don't stop. Please, Grandma, please, just stop." The plea in her daughter's voice was agonizing. The enemy was no longer just a shadow from the past. They were a clear and present danger, not just to her, but to the only family she had left. The glorious, world-changing truth she had uncovered now felt like a curse, one that threatened to burn down everything she loved. Claire's panicked voice over the phone, layered on top of the silent, violent chaos of her ransacked apartment, was a 1-2 punch that knocked the air from Eleanor's lungs. They will destroy our whole family. The threat wasn't just against her anymore. It had reached out and wrapped its tendrils around her son and granddaughter, the 2 people she loved most in the world. The righteous fire that had burned in her after leaving Mrs. Alvarez's house was doused by a tidal wave of ice-cold fear. What had she done? In her obsessive quest for a 75-year-old truth, she had put her own family in the crosshairs. The weight of that guilt was immediate and crushing. The ghosts of the Myers family suddenly seemed less important than the terrified voice of her living, breathing granddaughter. "I'll stop, baby," Eleanor lied, her voice a hoarse whisper, more for Claire's benefit than her own. "I'll stop everything, I promise." She hung up the phone, her hand shaking so badly she could barely press the button. She sank onto the floor amidst the mess, the violation of her home, a stark metaphor for her shattered sense of safety. They hadn't found her research. She had taken the most crucial documents with her to Mrs. Alvarez's. But that was a small, hollow victory. They had found her weakness. They had found Claire. For the first time, Eleanor truly felt like giving up. The cost was simply too high. For the next few days, she did nothing. She cleaned her apartment, putting everything back in its place, but the sense of order was a facade. The feeling of being watched, of being vulnerable, lingered in every room. She stayed home, ignored the ringing phone, and tried to convince herself that silence was the same as safety. But the story wouldn't let her go. The faces of Thomas and Margaret, the childish scrawl of Sarah Myers, the testimony of Mrs. Alvarez, they haunted her waking hours and filled her dreams. She was trapped between two impossible choices: abandon a murdered family to protect her own, or risk her family's safety for the sake of the dead. It was a moral quagmire, and she was drowning in it. Then, a thought occurred to her, a loose thread she hadn't yet pulled. The Myers were known to be church-going folk. If the official records had been erased, perhaps the churches had not. It was a long shot, a desperate grasp at a straw, but it was a move she could make quietly, without alerting Kearns or his watchdogs. It felt safer. She called Pastor John from St. Michael's, a man she knew to be quiet, kind, and deeply principled. She didn't tell him everything, just that she was doing some genealogical research on a family from the 1930s and had hit a dead end. Pastor John, a calm and deliberate man in his 60s, met her in the church's dusty, cavernous archive room. The air smelled of beeswax and old leather. He listened patiently as Eleanor explained what she was looking for, his expression unreadable. He was a pillar of the community, but Eleanor also knew he was a cautious man, deeply protective of his church and its history. He understood the delicate politics of the town better than anyone. "The Myers family," he said, his voice soft. "Yes, I know the name. A tragedy." He led her to a massive, iron-bound ledger. "Our records from that time are delicate." He opened the book, the pages crackling like autumn leaves. Together, they scanned the handwritten entries for births, baptisms, and marriages. Eleanor's hope began to fade as page after page revealed nothing. And then, there it was. A baptismal certificate for Sarah Myers, dated 1925. Eleanor's heart leaped. It was a small thing, but it was a piece of them, an official record of a life that the city had tried to erase, but it was the entry directly below it that made her gasp. A second baptismal certificate, from 1928, for a boy named Samuel Myers, a son. No one had ever mentioned a son. Every record, every newspaper clipping, had mentioned 2 children, implying Sarah and another daughter. But here was proof: the Myers family hadn't had 2 daughters. They'd had a son and a daughter. And then, a more chilling realization: every official document, every brief mention of the tragedy, referred to the family of 4. Thomas, Margaret, and their 2 children. They had never been named. Why hide the existence of a son? Why obscure their identities? This tiny detail felt monumental. It was another crack in the official story, another deliberate act of erasure. The brief moment of relief and connection was a powerful surge, a feeling that she was back on the right path. For a moment the fear receded and the thrill of the hunt returned. She had a new name: Samuel Myers. This discovery, this small but significant victory, made Eleanor reckless. The days of hiding in fear, of feeling powerless, had frayed her nerves. She was tired of being hunted, of playing defense. She now had Mrs. Alvarez's explosive testimony, the proof of a second, hidden child, and the ledger showing Alistair Kearns's involvement. She felt she had enough to blow the whole conspiracy wide open. Ignoring the frantic warnings from Claire and the cold, rational voice in her own head that screamed this was a mistake, she made a fateful decision. She called a journalist she knew, a young, ambitious reporter at the local paper named Ben Carter. She was desperate. She thought that bringing the story into the light of day would protect her, that Kearns wouldn't dare move against her if the public was watching. It was a gamble, born of fear and a burning need for a decisive victory. You might be screaming at her, telling her not to do it, that it's a trap, But in that moment of desperation, it felt like the only move she had left. She met Ben in a noisy diner, the smell of grease and coffee thick in the air. She laid out everything she had, the maps, the photos, the notes from her conversation with Mrs. Alvarez. Ben's eyes grew wider and wider as she spoke. He furiously scribbled notes, his face a mask of journalistic glee. "This is incredible," he breathed, looking at her with a mixture of awe and pity. "A cover-up this old? This is the story of a lifetime." Eleanor left the diner feeling a profound sense of relief, as if she had finally unburdened herself of a terrible weight. She had passed the torch. The truth was now in the hands of the press. Surely nothing could stop it now. The story ran 3 days later, on the front page, under a banner headline, "Local historian claims 7.5 YEAROLD flood was murder." Eleanor's heart pounded as she read it. But her relief quickly turned to horror. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. Ben, her supposed ally, had framed the entire story as the wild conspiracy theory of a grieving, slightly unstable widow. He mentioned her legal notice from the city, portraying her as a rogue agent with a vendetta. He quoted Richard Kearns extensively, who expressed his deepest sympathies for Mrs. Grant's personal troubles, and gently dismissed her claims as unfounded fantasies based on a misinterpretation of historical debris. Mrs. Alvarez's testimony was reduced to a single line about the unreliable memories of the elderly. The existence of the second child, Samuel, was omitted entirely. The story didn't expose a crime. It destroyed her. Kearns hadn't just weathered the storm, he had used it to shred what was left of her reputation. The public response was swift and brutal. Neighbors who used to greet her with smiles now crossed the street to avoid her. She received angry phone calls, people accusing her of stirring up trouble and disrespecting the dead. The Historical Society Board called an emergency meeting and asked for her resignation. But the cruelest blow came from Claire. She appeared at Eleanor's door that evening, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She was holding a copy of the newspaper. "Why?" Claire asked, her voice cracking with a pain that tore through Eleanor's heart. "I begged you to stop. You promised me. Now look, they're calling you crazy. People at school are laughing at me. You didn't think about me. You didn't think about Dad. You only thought about your ghosts." The raw hurt and betrayal in her granddaughter's voice was worse than any threat from Kearns. In her desperate attempt to find justice for a dead family, she had wounded her own. Claire turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing alone in her doorway, the damning newspaper in her hand, utterly and completely alone. She had lost everything, her credibility, her community, and the one person she couldn't bear to lose. Kearns had won. The silence Claire left behind was a living entity, a heavy, suffocating presence that filled every corner of Eleanor's apartment. It was a silence louder than any argument, colder than any threat. Claire's accusation, "You only thought about your ghosts," echoed in the stillness, a judgment that was both devastatingly unfair and horribly true. Eleanor had become so consumed by the dead that she had forgotten how to protect the living. The public humiliation was a deep, stinging wound, but the loss of Claire was a mortal blow. It shattered the last of her resolve. Kearns had achieved a victory more complete than he could have ever planned. He hadn't just silenced her, he had isolated her, leaving her adrift in a sea of her own making. The box of research sat in the back of her closet like a coffin. She had nothing left to fight with, and worse, nothing left to fight for. The cause of the Myers family felt hollow now, a foolish obsession that had cost her the only family she had. For a week, she moved through her days in a gray fog of grief and regret, the world outside her window muted and distant. In the depths of her solitude, Eleanor found herself sorting through a box of old family photographs, a painful but necessary act of penance. She was looking for a picture of her and Claire from happier times, a reminder of what she had lost. At the bottom of the box, beneath stacks of faded color prints from the 80s and 90s, were older, black and white photos of her own parents. And beneath those, a small, unassuming cardboard box tied with string. She didn't remember ever seeing it before. Her hands, moving with a numb curiosity, untied the knot. Inside were letters. dozens of them, bundled and dated, all written in her father's elegant, sloping script. They were letters he had written to his brother during his first years in California, long before Eleanor was born. She almost put them away, the ghosts of her own family too much to bear. But one bundle, postmarked 1932, caught her eye. Her fingers, almost of their own volition, slipped one of the letters from its brittle envelope. As she read, the world tilted on its axis. Her father wrote of his new job at a small but respected carpentry firm in Pasadena. He wrote of his boss, a good, principled man who was teaching him the trade, a man he admired deeply, a man named Thomas Myers. Eleanor dropped the letter as if it had burned her. Her own father, her quiet, gentle father, a man she had adored, had worked for Thomas Myers. He had been there. He had known them. He had been a part of their world in the days and weeks leading up to their disappearance. The shock was so profound, so utterly disorienting, that she couldn't breathe. 1,000 questions exploded in her mind. Why had he never spoken of it? Why, in all the years she had lived and breathed local history, had he never once mentioned that he knew the family at the heart of the city's most enduring mystery? The silence she had inherited from him, which she had always interpreted as a quiet, humble nature, was suddenly recast in a sinister new light. It wasn't humility. It was a secret. Her own family was tied to this tragedy, connected by a silence that stretched across generations. The realization was devastating. This wasn't just a story she had uncovered. It was a story that had been running through her own bloodline, unspoken and hidden, all along. She felt a wave of nausea, a dizzying sense of betrayal. The foundation of her own life, of her own identity, felt like it was crumbling beneath her. But as the initial shock subsided, something else took its place. A new, terrible clarity. Her father's silence was a part of the crime, another layer of the cover-up. Whether his silence was born of fear or something worse, she didn't know, but it was a silence she could no longer honor. The quest for the Myers family was now inextricably linked to the quest for her own history, for the truth of her own father. Her grief and isolation were burned away by a sudden, white-hot resolve. This was no longer just about justice. This was about redemption, for the Myers family and for her own. That night she knelt by her bed, an act she hadn't performed in years. The words of a formal prayer felt hollow, so she just spoke into the darkness of her room, a raw, broken plea. "I won't let silence win again," she vowed, the words a promise to the dead, to the living, and to herself. "I will not be quiet anymore." It was a moment of profound transformation. The despair was gone, replaced by a grim, unshakable determination. She had found a new reason to fight, one that was deeper and more personal than she could have ever imagined. The next day she emerged from her self-imposed exile, a different woman. The fearful, shamed person who had hidden from the world was gone. In her place was someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. She retrieved the research box from her closet, laying out the evidence on her kitchen table not as a collection of clues, but as a battle plan. She knew she was being watched. The legal notice had been a warning shot, the ransacking a physical threat. Now, they were just waiting for her to break. She started taking a different route every time she left her apartment, constantly checking her rearview mirror. It wasn't long before she saw it, a black sedan, nondescript and anonymous, always 2 or 3 cars behind her. It was there when she went to the grocery store. It was parked across the street from her apartment at night. They weren't hiding anymore. They were showing her the leash. The constant surveillance was a grinding psychological warfare designed to wear her down, to make her feel powerless and exposed. The anger it provoked in her was a clean, sharp-edged thing. Every time she saw the car, her resolve hardened. They were afraid of her. That was a weapon. Then came the move she had been expecting. A call from an unfamiliar number. Richard Kearns wanted to meet. He suggested a public place, a cafe downtown, a friendly chat to clear the air. Eleanor knew it was a trap, another attempt to intimidate her into silence. But she also knew she had to go. To refuse would be a sign of fear. She had to face him. The cafe was busy, the noise of chatter and clinking cups, a strange backdrop for their confrontation. Kearns was already there, sitting at a small corner table, a picture of calm, controlled power in his tailored suit. He smiled his empty smile as she approached. "Mrs. Grant, thank you for coming." He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Coffee?" She ignored the offer, sitting down and meeting his gaze directly. The small talk was excruciating. He asked about her family, feigning concern for her well-being, the words coated in a slimy layer of insincerity. Eleanor remained silent, refusing to engage in his game. Finally, he leaned forward, the pretense of civility dropping away like a mask. "I think we've reached a point where we need to be very clear with one another," he said, his voice a low, menacing purr. He methodically straightened his silverware, aligning the fork and knife with obsessive precision. "You've been a persistent nuisance, admirable in its own way. But your little historical project is now threatening to interfere with significant city development." He paused, looking at her as if she were a particularly stubborn insect. "There are powerful interests at stake here, Eleanor, interests that have been in place for a very long time." Then, he performed the gesture she had come to dread. He reached up and slowly, deliberately, adjusted his tie, his cold eyes never leaving hers. "Storms are a natural part of life on this coast," he said, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "They wash away everything, buildings, evidence, even people, if you let them." It was the closest he had come to a confession, a chilling admission wrapped in a threat. But as he spoke, Eleanor's eyes were drawn to a small notice on the cafe's community bulletin board just over Kearns's shoulder. It was a public planning announcement. Her blood ran cold. The city was planning a new shoreline reinforcement project, and the construction site was the exact location where the Myers house wreckage had washed ashore. The notice was dated for demolition and excavation to begin in 48 hours. 48 hours. That was it. That was the deadline. This wasn't just about protecting a historical crime, it was about destroying the last physical evidence forever. Kearns wasn't just warning her off, he was telling her she had already lost. In 2 days, the last chance to find whatever proof lay buried in those ruins would be gone, turned into dust and buried under tons of new concrete. This was the red zone, the final, desperate endgame. The words on the demolition notice, 48 hours, hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. Kearns's smug, reptilian smile seemed to widen as he watched the realization dawn on her face. He hadn't just come to threaten her. He had come to gloat, to twist the knife, to let her know that the game was already over. He had won. She was staring at the finish line, and he was about to bulldoze it into oblivion. The polite cafe society noise around them faded into a dull roar in her ears. 48 hours. 2 days to undo a 75-year-old crime before it was permanently sealed in a tomb of concrete and steel. The sheer impossibility of it was a crushing weight. She left the cafe in a daze, Kearns's final chilling words echoing in her mind. Storms wash away everything. He wasn't just talking about the past, he was giving her a direct order. Let it go, or be washed away with it. That night, sleep was a distant country she couldn't reach. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the meager collection of evidence she had risked everything for. It felt pitifully small against the vast, monolithic power of the city and the Kearns dynasty. For the first time, she truly felt the suffocating despair of utter hopelessness. She was an old woman with a box of paper, fighting against bulldozers and a century of corruption. She had failed. The silence of her apartment pressed in, amplifying the ache of her isolation, the raw wound of Claire's absence a constant throbbing pain. Just as she was about to concede defeat, to let the ghosts of the Myers family be buried for a final time, she heard a soft, hesitant knock on her door. Her heart leaped into her throat, the fear of Kearns's men, a coppery taste in her mouth. She crept to the door, peering through the peephole. It was Claire. Her granddaughter stood on the doorstep, shoulders slumped, her face pale and etched with worry. When Eleanor opened the door, Claire didn't speak. She just stepped inside and wrapped her arms around her grandmother, holding on tight. "I'm so sorry, Grandma," she whispered into Eleanor's shoulder, her voice thick with tears. "I was angry and scared, but I've been reading. I read everything you found and I was wrong. We have to finish this. Together. The relief that washed over Eleanor was so immense, so powerful, it left her weak in the knees. It was a feeling more potent than any victory, more restorative than any piece of evidence. She wasn't alone anymore. Hope, which had seemed like a dead and buried thing, was suddenly, miraculously, alive again. Claire's return was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, a beacon of light in the crushing darkness. With the clock ticking down, they had no time to waste. They spread the research out on the table, Claire's quick, tech-savvy mind a perfect complement to Eleanor's methodical, historical approach. "What are we missing?" Claire asked, her eyes scanning the documents. "There has to be something more. Something they couldn't erase." Eleanor's mind raced back to the day the wreckage was found. She remembered the sheer, violent chaos of the twisted beams, the way they had been torn apart. "Thomas Myers was a carpenter," she said, thinking aloud. "A good one. He built that house to last. He would have known about the storms, the floods. He would have built fail-safes, hiding places." The idea was a long shot, a desperate leap of faith, but it was all they had. If Thomas Myers knew he was in danger, if he feared he and his family might be washed away, he wouldn't have left his family's fate to chance. He would have left something behind. A message in a bottle. A final testimony. And he would have hidden it in the strongest, safest part of the house he had built with his own 2 hands. There was only one way to find out. The site was now an active construction zone, fenced off and patrolled. Getting in would be impossible during the day. They had to go that night, under the cover of the coming storm. Another weather front was moving in, a mirror of the one that had started it all. The irony was not lost on Eleanor. It felt like history was circling back on itself, giving them one last terrible chance to set things right. The plan was insane, dangerous, and almost certainly doomed to fail. But as she looked at her granddaughter, her face alight with a fierce, determined loyalty, Eleanor knew they had to try. That night, they dressed in dark clothes, their faces grim. The wind was already picking up, whipping the rain into a horizontal spray that stung their faces. They parked a few blocks away and made their way to the demolition site on foot, the roar of the surf a constant, thunderous presence. The fence was tall, topped with barbed wire, but Claire had come prepared, producing a pair of bolt cutters from her backpack. The snap of the metal links echoed unnervingly in the howling wind. They slipped through the gap, their hearts pounding. The site was a landscape from a nightmare. The remaining wreckage was piled in a massive skeletal mound, silhouetted against the stormy sky. Heavy machinery stood silent watch, like giant, sleeping beasts. Using flashlights with the beams carefully shielded, they began to search. It was like looking for a needle in a continent of haystacks. The rain soaked them to the bone, the wind threatening to tear them from their feet. For what felt like hours, they found nothing but splintered wood and rusted nails. Despair began to set in, a cold, bitter certainty that they were too late. Eleanor was about to suggest they give up when her foot caught on something half buried in the mud. It wasn't wood. It was metal. Working together, they dug frantically with their bare hands, the mud sucking at their fingers. It was the corner of a box. A heavy, steel lockbox, the kind used for important documents. It was wedged tight beneath a massive, warped support beam, the very heart of the house's foundation. This was it. This had to be it. As they worked to free it, the blinding headlights of a truck swept across the site, pinning them in their glare. The engine growled to life. 2 large, menacing figures emerged from the cab, Kearns's men. They started moving toward them, their intentions brutally clear. Panic seized Eleanor. They were trapped. "Leave it! Let's go!" she screamed at Claire over the storm, but just as they turned to run, a voice, sharp and furious, cut through the wind. "Stay right where you are." It was Kearns. He stepped out of the truck's passenger side, a look of pure, unadulterated rage on his face. He hadn't just sent his men, he had come himself to oversee the final burial of his family's secret. A tense, terrifying struggle ensued. One of the thugs grabbed for the box. Claire shoved him back, her youthful strength surprising him. The other man lunged for Eleanor. She stumbled backward, her hand slipping from the box. the mud and rain making it impossible to keep her grip. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it was all over. She was about to let go, to surrender the box to save themselves. The history of her own father's silence, of letting fear win, flashed through her mind. But then she looked at Claire, fighting with a ferocity Eleanor had never seen. In that instant, something shifted. Her father had stayed silent, but she would not. Claire pulled her back from the brink, her hand grabbing Eleanor's arm. "Don't you dare let go," she yelled. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, they wrenched the lockbox free. Clutching the heavy box between them, they scrambled back toward the fence, the men in close pursuit. Kearns screamed at them to stop, his voice a raw sound of fury and desperation. They squeezed through the fence, just as the men reached it, their grasping fingers inches from their clothes. They ran, fueled by terror and triumph, not stopping until the roar of the surf and Kearns's enraged shouts faded behind them. They collapsed into Eleanor's car, soaked, muddy, and gasping for breath, the steel box a cold, solid promise on the seat between them. They had it. They had escaped. They had the truth. Inside the car, with the storm raging around them, Eleanor used a crowbar from her trunk to pry open the rusted lock. The lid creaked open. Inside, miraculously preserved in oilcloth, was a small stack of papers and photographs. There were photos of the Myers family, smiling and vibrant, taken just days before the storm. A picture of Sarah on a swing, one of a small boy, Samuel, holding his father's hand. Beneath them was a multi-page document, written in Thomas Myers' strong, clear hand. It was a signed affidavit. The first sentence leaped off the page. "If this storm takes us, it was no accident." Eleanor's breath hitched, but it was the final page that revealed the true, horrifying scale of the conspiracy. It was a list of 3 other families who had also been resisting the city's relocation efforts, 3 other holdouts, and beside each name, a handwritten note, "Disappeared." Pine Ridge Fire 1931, vanished. Bridge collapse 1930. It wasn't just the Myers family. Kearns's grandfather hadn't just murdered one family. He had been a serial killer, using so-called natural disasters as his weapon to systematically eliminate anyone who stood in the way of his ambition. The storm hadn't just been used to cover up a single murder. It had been the final act in a multi-year campaign of terror and death. The contents of the lockbox laid bare a truth so monstrous it defied comprehension. It wasn't a cover-up of a single crime. It was the unmasking of a dynasty built on murder. Thomas Myers's affidavit was a voice from the grave, a meticulously documented indictment that reached across 3/4 of a century to point a finger directly at the heart of the city's founding families. He had not only anticipated his own death but had also recorded the fates of his neighbors, the other stubborn souls who had stood in the way of Alistair Kearns's ambition. The names on that list transformed the story from a tragedy into a massacre. Eleanor and Claire sat in the car, the storm raging outside a pale imitation of the tempest of emotion within them. The feeling was not one of simple victory. It was a profound, nauseating, and earth-shattering sense of awe at the sheer scale of the evil they had uncovered. The lockbox wasn't just evidence. It was a tombstone for 4 families who had been systematically erased from history. The next morning they didn't go to the local paper. They didn't go to the local police. The roots of this corruption were too deep, too entangled in the very institutions that were supposed to protect the innocent. Instead, Claire used her digital savvy to contact a well-respected investigative journalist at the Los Angeles Times, someone with a national reputation for taking down powerful, corrupt figures. They met in secret, handing over not just the lockbox, but copies of every piece of evidence Eleanor had gathered. They told the entire story, from the impossible wreckage on the shore to the final, terrifying confrontation at the demolition site. The journalist listened, her expression shifting from skepticism to shock, and finally, to a grim, focused resolve. The story broke a week later. It wasn't just a front-page article, it was an atom bomb that detonated over the city's political landscape. The affidavit, the names of the other vanished families, the connection to Alistair Kearns, and the subsequent decades of silence, it all came out. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Richard Kearns resigned in disgrace before the sun had set, his family name forever transformed from a symbol of civic pride to a mark of monstrous criminality. State investigators swarmed City Hall, seizing records, and a special prosecutor was appointed. The carefully constructed facade of the city's history crumbled into dust. In the weeks that followed, the story grew. Descendants of the other three families from Thomas Myers's list came forward, bringing with them their own fractured family stories of ancestors who had vanished in sudden, unexplained accidents. The city was forced to formally acknowledge not one but 4 families who had been murdered in the name of progress. At the shoreline where the wreckage had been found, where bulldozers had been poised to erase the last vestiges of the crime, a new plan was made. It would not be a site for shoreline reinforcement. It would become a memorial park. The names of the Myers, the Abbotts, the Pareses, and the Chens, the families who had been silenced for so long, were to be engraved in stone. It was a victory. It was justice, but it was a victory that came at a steep and painful price. Eleanor had won the war, but she returned to a hometown that felt like a foreign country. She had exposed a truth the community was not prepared to face. Old neighbors, some whose own families had benefited from the progress the Kearns family had championed, now looked at her with a mixture of resentment and fear. She was no longer just Eleanor Grant, the retired schoolteacher. She was the woman who had stirred up trouble, the woman who had unearthed the rot beneath their peaceful, prosperous lives. The whispers followed her in the grocery store, at the post office. The relationships and friendships she had spent a lifetime building were now fractured, some broken beyond repair. She had given the city its history back, but in doing so, she had lost her own place within it. The most profound cost, however, was a quieter one. The discovery that her own father had known the Myers family, that he had carried their secret in silence his entire life, left a permanent scar on her memory of him. She understood his fear. He was a young man, an employee, likely terrified into silence by the same forces that had murdered his boss. But the knowledge of his complicity, however passive, was a heavy burden to bear. It was a lingering shadow, a bittersweet ache that tainted the triumph of justice. She had broken the cycle of silence in her family, but she now had to live with the knowledge of how deeply it had run. On a cool, sunny morning a few months later, Eleanor and Claire stood together at the dedication of the memorial park. A simple, elegant granite wall now stood overlooking the Pacific, the names of the 4 families etched into its surface. Descendants of the victims wept openly, touching the cold stone as if they could feel the presence of those they had never known. The mayor gave a speech full of somber apologies and promises of a new era of transparency. It all felt distant to Eleanor, the political theater a hollow echo of the real, human cost. When the speeches were over and the crowds began to thin, Eleanor walked to the wall. She ran her fingers over the names: Thomas, Margaret, Sarah, and Samuel Myers. They were home now. Their names were no longer a secret whispered in the margins of history, but a public monument to their courage. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, dented tin whistle. It had been with her through it all, a constant, tangible link to the child who had lost everything. She held it for a long moment, the sea breeze whistling softly over its opening, a final, mournful song. Then she turned to Claire and placed the whistle in her granddaughter's hand. "They're home now," Eleanor said, her voice thick with an emotion that was equal parts grief and peace. "And we don't keep quiet anymore." Claire closed her hand around the whistle, her eyes meeting her grandmother's in a moment of profound, shared understanding. They had not just solved a crime, they had changed their own history, broken their own family's legacy of silence. The scars would remain, a testament to the cost of truth. But as they stood together, looking out at the endless expanse of the ocean that had both hidden and revealed a terrible secret, they knew they had done the right thing. They had chosen to speak for the dead, and in doing so, they had given new meaning to their own lives.